Black History Month celebration is Americans Who Tell the Truth as applied to the black environment and black movement. Americans Who Tell the Truth are a nonprofit organization led by and started by Robert Shutterly, artist and historian, and he has created over 270 portraits, some of which you can see here, of courageous Americans who have identified and addressed really critical issues. As part of his artwork, there's a statement by the individuals. He's also generated unique narratives for each of the people. Because of this work and some of his other work in terms of being an author, he is the subject of a documentary called Truth Tellers. For our program, we have selected 14 portraits, and these are depicted on the wall here. And these are, we've picked them as models of courageous citizens. And hopefully you'll be able to tie these into what the themes are. This is the third of 4 weeks that we're doing this program, the third of 4 presentations. And these are themed presentations which pair paintings with experts for a discussion. So please feel free to actually interrupt if you need to during the talk today. I'd like to give a shout out to Alice Dillon, who brought Americans Who Tell the Truth to our attention several times. So please, round of applause for Alice. And we have a privilege today of a very special guest, Marion Dillon Morris, who's the board head of Americans Who Tell the Truth, who will say a few words. Welcome, please welcome.
Can you hear me? Okay. I have to apologize. I'm going to read this because I'm terrible at just sort of speaking off the cuff. As mentioned, my name is Marion Dillon Morris, and I am fortunate to serve as board chair of Americans Who Tell the Truth. I was asked to say a few words, and I promise it'll be just a few, as I know I and everyone else are looking forward to hearing from Ethel Washington.
Rebecca Williams.
It's okay. I'm flattered.
Well,
I'm
that's a good
flattered.
start.
I'm flattered.
There'll be a quiz at the end.
So glad I wrote it down. Oh, let's see if I can do better now. I would like to thank Alan McGinley, who I guess is not here this evening, but is your director of your library, and Jerry Skotnicki, and the Friends of the Library, and the MLK Association, and especially my mother, Alice Dillon, who's been such a strong advocate for bringing AWTT here to Westfield Library. What began with a single portrait of Walt Whitman created in 2003 has come to be close to 280 portraits, many of which actually are in 3 books that I've placed in the back. If you're interested in those, each one has 50 portraits, and they're on 3 separate specific areas of rights. One is racial justice, environmental justice, and peacemakers. Also on the back table are some cards that correspond to some of the portraits that are here and some of them that aren't. And those are free to you to take home with you. As Jerry mentioned, there's a documentary called Truth Tellers. It's not super easy to access right now. It was on PBS in New Jersey, I think like 3 weeks ago, maybe. If you're interested in that, I can give you some information on how you can access that as well. Here we go. I wanted to let you know that in addition to the portraits, AWTT has grown to encompass a variety of educational programs, which you can learn more about on the website if you are interested. These include opportunities to read about and hear directly from portrait subjects and become part of nationwide school programs. As I mentioned, I've got the books and the cards back there, and I want to thank you again, everyone, for coming out tonight and for supporting Americans Who Tell the Truth and your public library.
One last thing I'd like to do is I'd like to thank the team. This is a pretty ambitious undertaking. I just wanted to thank the team, and the team is listed, and all the contributors to this program are listed on the first page of your booklet. I also was remiss in telling you that the portraits are here, the 14, and the quotes are there, and the QR codes represent the narratives that have been written. An abbreviated version of the narratives are also in your booklet. So I just wanted to tell you that. And one last reminder before we start with our program, where's Velvet? Oh, next week's program is not on Tuesday, it's on Monday evening. So just recognize all the rest of them have been on Tuesdays. So it's Monday evening. Without further ado, Velvet.
Hello, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing this beautiful young lady up here tonight. I'd like to welcome everyone to this Black History celebration. My name is Velvet Rogers. I serve on the board of the Friends. That's better. The Friends of the Westfield Memorial Library. I am also the executive director of the Westfield Community Center in Westfield, New Jersey. We are a resource center in partnership with the Union County Division on Aging. We serve communities throughout the throughout Union County. A lot of our programs, if not most of our programs, are funded by the Union County Board of County Commissioners. And I say that to say, I'm really excited to give a little history on tonight's speaker, Commissioner Rebecca L. Williams. Thanks for all you do for us, Rebecca. Commissioner Rebecca L. Williams was elected. Let me stop. Shake it off. Was elected to her first full 3-year term in November 2019 and was re-elected to the second full term in 2022. In 2022, she also served her first term as chair of Union County Board of County Commissioners. This year, she would be serving as chair of the board's Parks and Programming Committee and as a member of the Fiscal and Public Works and Facility Committees, respectively. Commissioner Williams has served on panels at the Leagues of Municipalities, the Center of African Women and Politics at Rutgers Eagleton Institute, the National Council of Negro Women, and Garden State Equality, among many other organizations. Commissioner Williams is a full-time faculty member of the Humanities Division of Essex County College in Newark, where she teaches American literature, African American literature, effective speech, English composition, and women's literature. All, let's welcome Rebecca, Commissioner Rebecca L. Williams.
Thank you, Velvet. Thank you, Jerry. I want to thank the Westfield Library staff for hosting this month-long series of events. As you said, Americans who tell the truth. The best fiction tells the truth, right? What do you think that means? Tells the truth, right? There's sort of a truth to everything that we do, everything that we think and write down. Tonight's presentation, and I was telling Jerry this earlier, I want it to be a little bit more interactive. I don't want to lecture necessarily, and my focus this evening is, I will say a little bit about the writers who are represented in the portraits, with a more particular focus on a few writings by Zora Hurston. Many folks are familiar with Their Eyes Were Watching God and a few of her more well-known novels. But I wanted to look at, for some of these writers, I wanted to look at their work in literary criticism and their work as Black artists. So I've compiled some quotes that I think will lead us to sort of a nice discussion. Oh, okay. No, I can see, yes. So again, I want to thank you all. I do want to acknowledge the presence of my colleague, Betty Jane Kowalski, Commissioner Kowalski is here as well. Great big supporter of the arts and culture here in Union County. And I also have, and we can look at this later when we turn the lights on. I also brought a little show and tell, a few works that I think that I believe the Westfield Library may have one, but since you're part of the consortium, these books are available throughout. Okay, so I'm just gonna. Oh, actually, I think this works as well. Okay, I'm just gonna start. And these, of course, are portraits, photographs of Zora Neale Hurston, Ralph Ellison, and, of course, James Baldwin, all of whom are represented here. All right. So I've already been introduced. And so I want to look at Ralph Ellison, a few quotes that he made about Black writers and Black literature. I also have some material on Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes, as well as James Baldwin. So I'll talk a little bit about these, and then I want to open up the discussion to sort of talk about writing and about what it means to be a Black artist. I'm sorry. There we go. Okay. So I do want to dedicate this evening to the memory of Toni Morrison. Today is Toni Morrison's birthday, so can we get a happy birthday to Toni Morrison? So the first quote that I have is a quote by Toni Morrison from a series of lectures that she made as a Nobel laureate, and it was pulled together in a collection called Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, that I believe may be here. What she did with that series of lectures was she opened up a whole new world of critical interrogation of writers such as Edgar Allan Poe, William Faulkner, Herman Melville, and she's, and part of what she was trying to get at is that when we look at Black writers, there's always this way of looking at them through the lens of race, and white writers, by and large, were excluded from that kind of interrogation. So she interrogates whiteness. And there actually is a discipline you probably know called whiteness studies, where it's not just about the other, but whiteness is also a race and a color in our society in terms of how we operate, right? We say, I don't see color. We say, race is a biological construct, right? And we know this. Any scientist will tell you that. But we certainly don't live our lives that way, right? So I wanted to read this quote. Can you all hear me well enough with this microphone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. It just makes it a little easier. Okay. Narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. We will not blame you if your reach exceeds your grasp. If love so ignites your words, they go down in flames and nothing is left but their scald. Or if, with the reticence of a surgeon's hands, your words suture only the places where blood might flow. So narrative is radical. Writing can be a radical act. And I'm going to go on. There's a couple more things that she says as part of this quote, and then we'll move on. For our sake and yours, forget your name in the street. Tell us what the world has been to you in the dark places and in the light. Don't tell us what to believe, what to fear. Show us belief's wide skirt and the stitch that unravels fear's call. So, of course, she is a master of metaphor. as you as you can see, right? And then she says, and don't take this personally, anyone, you know, you old woman, blessed with blindness, can speak the language that tells us what only language can, how to see without pictures. Language alone protects us from the scariness of things with no names. Language alone is meditation. Comments? Or is that drop the mic moment? Right? Very, very powerful. Right? And Morrison wrote a lot and she spoke a lot about language. And of course, with Toni Morrison, we're familiar with her works, right? Beloved, Sula, The Bluest Eye, but she also has quite a body of critical work. Toni Morrison, before she wrote The Bluest Eye and while she was writing it, she served as an editor at Random House. And she brought us Gail Jones, Wesley Brown, and other African-American writers whom she nurtured and supported in her own way. And I have one little anecdote about Toni Morrison before we move on. Years and years ago, when I was in college, one of my college professors, she lived up on the Hudson River, along the Hudson. So she had invited a bunch of us students up to a barbecue, right, after the semester's over. And then afterwards she said, okay, we're gonna go for a walk. We're gonna do a constitutional and we are going to walk. So we're walking along the river up on the highway, but near the river, and she points out a house. She says, Toni Morrison lives down there. So we were all excited, right? There are a bunch of books that were left alongside the highway, right, with the word free on them, right? But we're college students, we're wandering around, taking our constitutional. We don't want to carry anything with us. And it was only later that she said, you know, those were books that Toni Morrison was tossing. So I always think about that, and I think about, you know, what kind of marginal notes did she make? What was she reading? You know, some of it looked like maybe literature, and some of it looked like, you know, regular, you know, bubble cover, romantic kind of stuff. So I don't know, but I think about that a lot. You know, I could have had Toni Morrison's books, you know? Okay, so just to move along a little bit, right? So here's one of the things that she says that I think is really important, and some of you may even be familiar with this aspect of her, because after she won the Nobel Prize for Literature, she appeared on a lot of shows, you know, talking about writing and what it means to be a black writer. What is black writing? What is white writing? And so she says, I never asked Tolstoy, because the context here is she was asked, why does she only write for black people? Or does she only write for black people? Shouldn't she be writing for everyone? So she says, I never asked Tolstoy to write for me, a little colored girl in Lorain, Ohio. I never asked James Joyce not to mention Catholicism or the world of Dublin. Never. And I don't know why I should be asked to explain your life to you. Meaning, why does she not have white characters by and large in her novels? We have splendid writers to do that, but I am not one of them. It is that business of being universal, a word hopelessly stripped of meaning for me. So this idea that there is some universal novel, that there's a way that you can write, that you can read Chekhov, right, as a black girl growing up in Jamaica, Queens, and understand, but you cannot, as a white person, say, living in Westfield, understand what you're reading when you read Toni Morrison. This is sort of what she's getting at, this idea that to be universal means to be sort of raceless, but only when it pertains to black writers. White writers are writing about their lives, right? Their white lives, okay? And those matter. Just a joke. She goes on. She says, Faulkner wrote what I suppose could be called regional literature and had it published all over the world. That's what I wish to do. If I tried to write a universal novel, it would be water. Behind this question is the suggestion that to write for Black people is somehow to diminish the writing. From my perspective, there are only Black people. When I say people, that's what I mean. So, any comments? What do you think about this quote, or are we a little too early? Do you need it to marinate? Okay, we'll let it marinate. But I do want to pause at certain points, and I certainly would like to hear from you all in terms of what you're thinking about some of, what Toni Morrison, the critic, is saying. Yes. Oh, and we have a mic.
Yeah, so, is this on? Is the mic on? Thanks. So, what I feel she's saying is that the minority, meaning Black people, the minority isn't given the same weight or the same consideration or the same respect, right?
Right. That's exactly what she's
That's
saying.
how I feel it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because to be a Black writer, to write about Black things, you're writing only for Black people. But Tolstoy and Faulkner are writing for everyone, right? And this is, and some of the other quotes that I have here by a couple of other writers, provide this, give this same sort of feedback in terms of how their writing is assessed, okay? Toni Morrison also said, and this is really important, Black literature is taught as sociology, as tolerance, not as a serious, rigorous art form. So, anybody here read Native Son by Richard Wright? Okay, so you're familiar with that, right? And that, of course, is the story of Bigger Thomas, this young Black man who is raised in poverty. He becomes violent, almost bestial. He rapes and kills a Black woman. More importantly, he kills a young white woman. And, Richard Wright, focused on the socioeconomic factors that led him to do this, right? And there are other works that follow along that same line. Naturalism, right, is the literary movement that, it falls under. But Toni Morrison, in The Bluest Eye, if anyone here has read The Bluest Eye, it's a story of a young Black girl who is traumatized by racism. She is raped by her father. She goes, she suffers from mental illness at the end and lives in a world of fantasy where she wants blue eyes because blue-eyed people are treated much better than she is, viewed as an ugly little Black girl, right? This was Toni Morrison's first novel, published in 1970. And she wrote a foreword where she, and I look at that foreword that she wrote 20 years later as sort of a precursor to the conversation that she has in Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, where she says, the story of Piccola, when you read The Bluest Eye, don't think this is all Black people, that all Black people have, pathological lives, all Black people suffer and so forth. She says this is a unique experience that she is writing about. But there is a tendency, or there had been a tendency by critics, often liberal critics, to look at a novel like that and not to look at what Morrison is doing with language, all the language experiments that she did in that novel with stream of consciousness and so forth, but to look at it as this is something that you should be reading in a sociology class so that you will understand the pathology in the Black community, right? So here she is making an argument that the same way that you look at Crime and Punishment, for example, right? You look at it as a work of literature, look at the work of Black writers in the same way, okay? Now, I wanted to move on, and that was I just wanted to say something about Toni Morrison because, as I said, she opened up a whole world of study for younger scholars coming along after, this, what she won the Nobel Prize. 93, she writes, Playing in the Dark. And we're sitting here 30 years later, and if you do read literary criticism or, long book reviews, right, you get a sense of, how works are being interpreted and or interrogated differently. Right? So just a little bit about Ralph Ellison, and I have, I think, 2 quotes from him. So, of course, just a little biographical information. He's born in Oklahoma City. He attended Tuskegee Institute for a few years, and if you have read Invisible Man, he sort of lampoons or satirizes his experience at Tuskegee Institute as a sort of a elite kind of school where people were just as pretentious as they would be at any other school. He became friends with Richard Wright. They both were part of the Communist Party, and they wrote for a number of the magazines back then. He wrote a lot of book reviews and essays, and he, of course, publishes Invisible Man in 1952, and this makes him world famous. He writes one other novel, Juneteenth, which was published posthumously. But he also was an excellent literary critic. So he wrote 2 collections, one, Shadow and Act, in 1964, and the other was called Going to the Territory, later essays on literary criticism, as it pertains partly to some literary criticism of other works, but he also comes back to this question about what it means to be a Black artist and certain hurdles that Black artists have to experience to be taken seriously that perhaps others don't have, right? So, and the focus was really about artistic freedom versus the sort of patronizing, I'm sorry, this is popping a little bit, the patronizing non-criticism by white critics, particularly liberal critics in magazines like Dissent and so forth. So just a couple of quotes by him, and then if you want, we can stop. So he asks these questions, and I want you to think about this. Why is it so often true that when critics confront the American as Negro, they suddenly drop their advanced critical armament and revert with an air of confident superiority to quite primitive modes of analysis? Why is it that sociology-oriented critics seem to rate literature so far below politics and ideology that they would rather kill a novel than modify their presumptions concerning a given reality which it seeks in its own terms to project? So you may see some bits of Toni Morrison writing, 40 years later about the same type of thing. Finally, why is it that so many of those who would tell us the meaning of Negro life never bother to learn how varied it really is? Okay, and this is an important essay he writes called The World and the Jug, which appears in Shadow and Art. And he talks a lot in this essay also about Richard Wright, preeminent writer, a great writer, but one who still seemed to be stuck in sociological aspects of Black pathology. And Bigger does not have a chance to succeed because of the weight of racism and oppression. Not that those were not and are not real things, but Ellison is saying that shouldn't be the only kind of writing. Other people have other kinds of experiences that are just as valid and should be looked at artistically, as valid art, just as, say, a Richard Wright. Okay. Any comments on this quote? Okay. I don't want to just keep moving on if you are thinking about this or if you have a comment. I see a couple of people nodding their heads. Okay. And then we come to, and we'll go back to what you'll see is what I've tried to do is thematically, kind of look at all of this writing, all this literary criticism to say something maybe larger about Black writing. Okay? So we come to James Baldwin, who we celebrated his centennial last year, born in 1924. And he writes, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. I'd like to stop here for a moment. How do you interpret this? All right.
At first blush, when I read that, I thought to myself that whatever power these words carry and how it affects you, it is even more important than what is not on the page and how it should affect you. Does that make any sense? Because I'm thinking it's more terrible than anyone has ever said. That to me is just so powerful. What is behind it that is not been written?
Yeah, and you think about the historical moment in which, you know, Baldwin is operating, and we certainly understand that, right? The fire bombings of homes, just everything that leads up to the civil rights movement, right? All the violence and discrimination and, you know, the legacy of slavery, the genocide of Native American peoples and so forth, right? That's a terrible part. But I put this quote up because I want you to also keep in mind that he says it's also more beautiful, right? There are terrible things, but there are some moments of beauty, right? And we see that coming out in art that we have around us, and certainly in writing and in other forms. We got another question back there, or comment?
I've kind of always been a fan of James Baldwin, and one of my favorite quotes that he said was, to be black is to be American without privilege and African without knowledge. And what he was trying to say is that that's the history that's longer, that we are kind of walking in almost like a shell because we're connected to our birthplace, that we don't know our language, but we're connected to them, and we're also connected here, but we don't have the privilege of being here. And he was very defiant, like in a lot of his stuff, like, you know, he was very defiant, like, I'm gonna stay here. But and then he did go to Europe because he couldn't stay here. So he was kind of like, there was a lot of duality with him. Like, he was this, and he writes about relationships, he writes about gay relationships, heterosexual relationships. So he kind of does a lot of things, but I think that's what he means, that the history, particularly for black people, is a lot longer than we realize. We're not just American. Like, we have a birthplace that we just don't really know a lot about.
Right. Thank you. Yes. And of course, Baldwin wrote, you know, Go Tell It on the Mountain. He wrote plays like The Amen Corner, Blues for Mr. Charlie. He wrote If Beale Street Could Talk, Giovanni's Room, right? But he too, and this is why I want you to see this side of him if you're not familiar, he too wrote a number of essays, critical essays that I think, you know, deserve wider attention, right? So American history is terrible, but it can also be beautiful, right? Oh, we have another comment?
No, I was just going to add, you know, with Jimmy being from Harlem, he had that New York Harlem swag. So he had seen more than just the national despair or disdain. You know, Harlem was a tough place to grow up at the time he grew up. And then him being, you know, part of the LGBT community, it was an anomaly then. So now we have a community. Back then it was taboo. So he was kind of trapped in between inner city poverty and the fact that he was gay. So, and then he had this brilliant mind, very gifted from where he come from. So these words encompass a lot when it comes to Baldwin. He very gifted mind, beyond where he was raised.
One of the greatest intellects of the 20th century. And Baldwin, he left high school before graduating. He was not formally educated in college, right? But he goes, to your point, he leaves New York and he goes over to Europe because he felt in some ways he would end up being a statistic, right? If he did not escape, especially as a young gay black man, struggling with his sexual identity and also dealing with, as you mentioned, poverty, with racism. But he was incredibly gifted, right, as a writer, and it was seen, right? Oh, I just went beyond. I wanted to show you this slide because, of course, he, as you mentioned, born in New York City. He attended DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, and he became close friends with Richard Avedon, the famous fashion photographer. They went to high school together. So this is a picture, I just thought you'd like that, a picture of him with Richard Avedon, and that portrait, the other portrait that I showed was a photograph of him by Richard Avedon. And there's a book that the two of them wrote together. I tried to get it, but it cost $1,600. So, yeah, the first edition. And it came out, they re-released it in 2017. That one's only $500. And on my poor teacher salary, But he was friends with Richard Avedon. He was also friends with Richard Wright. And, and their friendship lasted throughout. The friendship with Richard Avedon, the friendship with Richard Wright, who was sort of like a literary father to younger writers. They had this sort of falling out because Baldwin, too, felt that, being viewed as this sort of black artist writing sociological type of work was too constraining. So he writes this essay called Everybody's Protest Novel, where he takes Harriet Beecher Stowe to task for writing, for the popularity of Uncle Tom's Cabin, because he says it's got a level of importance, but it's sentimental drivel that does not really get at the heart of things. Now, I give Harriet Beecher Stowe a little more leeway because of who she is and the time in which she was living and operating. But Baldwin was a very fierce critic. I'm gonna move a little more quickly because I do wanna save a little time. I'm sorry, okay? But I just have some quotes by Baldwin. When you're writing, you're trying to find out something which you don't know. The whole language of writing for me is finding out what you don't want to know, what you don't want to find out, but something forces you to anyway. Any comments on that? What does that mean? How do you interpret that? What does he mean? You're finding out things that you don't want to know. Yeah, right here.
I think in literature, and I read a lot of varied literature, that when you read them, you realize that a lot of personal life comes through what they're writing. That they have a connection to whatever the abuse might have been, or the hardships, so I think that's probably some of the fear when they're generating a character or a storyline, that it is personal. And it may take them down a road where they see something of themselves or something in their past.
Yeah, it's this sort of process of discovery, right? And you discover things. I have my students, when I'm teaching, sometimes we do free writing session, and I say, just start writing. I'll give them a little prompt. And some students will write 4 or 5 sentences and stop. Other students will just keep writing. So where they start is so far from where they end. But that's the process of writing. And of course, as you all know, our students today, they write everything on computer, or they write it on their phones. I give them a piece of paper and they have to handwrite, because there's a whole different experience. And, studies have shown that there's a different relationship that you have when you are writing, that whole mind-body connection. It frees your thinking in a different kind of way. And they don't believe me, but then after they do some writing, then okay, Professor, you're correct. So just a couple more. Baldwin also says the responsibility of a writer is to excavate the experience of the people who produced him. So in that sense, he is saying you should write, they say write what you know. Some people say, well, I don't know anything, right? The process of writing will help you find out some things, right? Not necessarily saying that you can only write about, the people, so-called people who produced you, right? But that's where things germinate from, okay? And just a couple of others, right? He says, one writes out of one thing only, one's own experience. Everything depends on how relentlessly one forces from this experience the last drop, sweet or bitter, it can possibly give. This is the only real concern of the artist, to recreate out of the disorder of life that order which is art. I really like this quote because I think that it's, if we want to talk about universality, this is something that I think all writers, anybody here writers, poets? Okay, well, you read it, oh, there we go. Yeah, so you feel that, right? Right? Okay. And, there were, this particular essay that Baldwin writes, it's from an essay called Many Thousands Gone, part of his collection Notes of a Native Son, where he's talking about, again, this idea of what the Negro is, right? He says the story of the Negro in America is the story of America. Or more precisely, it is the story of Americans. It is not a very pretty story. The story of a people is never very pretty. The Negro in America, gloomily referred to as that shadow which lies athwart our national life, is far more than that. He is a series of shadows, self-created, intertwining, which now we helplessly battle. One may say that the Negro in America does not really exist except in the darkness of our minds. And here he's talking about how Black people are perceived, particularly through literature. Right? Again, if we think about Richard Wright as, and here he's actually sort of talking about Richard Wright. I'm going to skip through a couple of these. In this particular quote, he says, now the most powerful and celebrated statement we have yet had of what it means to be a Negro in America is unquestionably Richard Wright's Native Son. Right, with all of the pathology and the violence and so forth. And there's an essay written by Brent Staples called Black Men in Public Space that he wrote in the 1980s, where he talks about, walking down the street and he's whistling Vivaldi's Four Seasons so that the young white woman walking ahead of him, he's a black man, won't see him as a threat. Or white women grasping their purses more closely in the elevator, thinking that he, as a young man, is about to mug them, right? And you see other writers, I looked at that essay with my students, and several of the young Black men said, nothing has changed 40 years later, right? So he's going on, and it's as if all young Black men are bigger Thomases from Native Son, ready to commit violence for no other reason than they're pathological and poverty and sadness and the slums, right? And this was the way when Native Son came out. There were a lot of critics, white critics, who said, oh my God, this is the first real portrait of Black America we've ever seen, as if there's nothing else but that. So we see these younger writers like Baldwin, pushing up against that one sort of portrait, saying, and Toni Morrison later too, saying our lives are more rich, more varied than what you might think from the kind of literature that you want to publish. Now, I do want to just say a little bit about Zora Neale Hurston, so I'm going to skip, right? Two things. And I know I was supposed to talk about the Westfield connection. That's what I'm going to get to as my last bit, okay? So Langston Hughes writes an essay called The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, 1926, right? Baldwin is writing about the same thing in 1955. Toni Morrison is writing about the same thing in 1993. And I'm sure if you look at some recent criticism, you'll see that other black writers are still trying to, overcome this idea that they can only write about certain things, especially if they pertain to a particular pathology or a particular socioeconomic reality that some people have, but not all. So he says, one of the most promising of the young Negro poets said to me once, I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet, meaning, I believe, I want to write like a white poet, meaning subconsciously. I would like to be a white poet, meaning behind that, I would like to be white. And I was sorry the young man said that, for no great poet has ever been afraid of being himself. Okay? So he is saying the same thing that these other writers are saying decades later in this 1926 essay about the racial mountain, meaning for black artists, you have to climb this mountain, okay? And he says, but this is the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America. This urge within the race toward whiteness. So he's not discounting, he's not saying it's all coming externally. Sometimes it's internalized, right? The desire to pour race individuality into the mold of American standardization and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible. As if Negroes, black people, aren't also American, right? And intertwining. So now, okay. Zora Neale Hurston, as you all probably know, right? She lived at 405 West Broad Street, right off the corner there, right? When she and Langston Hughes were writing The Mule Bone, this play they wrote together. And he lived on Downer Street. So a couple of weeks ago, I went to both those places. They're like 3 minutes away. So you can just imagine she's saying, okay, Langston, I'm on my way, and going to his house, right? And then he's like, okay, let's work on Act 2 and going to his house, right? So you can see that even in the, I guess historically it's the black section of Westfield, you all have a really good handout on black history here in Westfield with the Black Business District and so forth. So if anybody here has not seen it, you should take a look because it's a really good handout, right? So they lived around the corner from each other. And but the thing that you may not know as well is that Zora Neale Hurston, 5 years before the Westfield connection, she actually lived in Roselle. Because in this book, A Life in Letters by Carla Kaplan, really great biographer, she pulls together all of Hurston's letters that are extant. And she wrote a letter to Georgia Douglas Johnson, very important Harlem Renaissance poet who probably not many people know of, but if you take a look at her poetry, it's just wonderful. She wrote a letter to her, and she also wrote a letter to Annie Nathan Meyer, who was one of the founders of Barnard College, where Hurston went to train as an anthropologist. And she lived in Plainfield for a short time at 624 West 4th Street. She wrote another letter to Annie Nathan Meyer. So I don't know if the Westfield Library has a Life in Letters, but you will learn so much about Zora Neale Hurston from those. She was a difficult woman, very politically conservative in many ways, and she had a lot to say about everyone. About W.E.B. Du Bois, she called him Dr. Dubious. Yeah, she was not a Pan-Africanist by any stretch of the imagination, but she still asks Du Bois in this one letter. She says, "Hey, we need to have a cemetery of great Negroes. Oh, I don't need to be in it, but we need this cemetery really to celebrate black writers." So, if Westfield has this, I know it's in the consortium somewhere, but if you have, Westfield has this, it's really well worth taking a read through, and then you can see a few, read the letters that she wrote from Westfield and so forth. I know I'm running out of time here, but of course we know they wrote The Mule Bone, and they had a really serious falling out. This is a photo of them with Jessie Fawcett on the far left. This is them at Tuskegee Institute, and they're pretty young here. Zora Neale Hurston, of course, she shaved 10 years off her age, so it took scholars a while to realize that when she was, at Barnard, she was like 10 years older than she said. There's another book here. Let's see if the library has this one. It's called Zora and Langston, and it's really about their relationship and their falling out. So it's in the consortium if it's not exactly at this library. But it's I haven't read the whole book, but it's an interesting read, as they say, right? And Zora Neale Hurston, her sense of humor was such that, she, as much as she genuflected, calling herself a pickaninny to her white patron, her major patron, Charlotte Osgood Mason, she also called these white benefactors the Negrotarians. You all know what the Rotary Club is, right? So they were the Negrotarians, right? And she had other choice words. But I wanted to introduce you to just a couple of things. These are the last couple of things. Early stories by Hurston, Spunk and Sweat. These are really, really great short stories where she tackles issues of domestic violence and abuse in ways that you would not read from other writers. She also, of course, celebrated rural life. When Black people coming out of slavery, right, are writing these works, she, one of the reasons she had a problem, Richard Wright had a problem with her, was he felt she should be writing about racism and an oppression, and she's writing about, Janie Starks and having 3, boyfriends, 3 husbands, and, she's writing about these things, celebrating rural language and, the agency and autonomy of Black women, and he had a problem with that. She was, I don't know that I would have been friends with her because she was tough, but she probably was still at the same time very fabulous. So she also writes this piece called Story in Harlem Slang, where wait till I light up my coal pot and I'll tell you about this zigaboo called Jelly. Well, all right now. He was a sealskin brown and papa tree top tall, skinny in the hips and solid built for speed. He was born with this rough dried hair, but he laid on the grease and pressed it down overnight with his stocking. So she created this sort of dictionary, like a glossary of urban slang, similar to if you, I know I'm old when I don't understand some of the slang that my students use, right? But you go online, right? You go to the Urban Dictionary, and it's like, oh, that's what they meant. So they weren't insulting me, okay, right? But she did that back in the 1930s, creating this dictionary of slang. And then just 2 other things. This book, and I have actually, I'll pass it around. It's it was a compendium of writing called Negro. Came out in 1934, and it was edited and put together by Nancy Cunard, the heiress to the Cunard shipping line. And this is an abridged edition. I actually saw a first edition at my college. They had one. It's huge. It was old and it's crumbly, but I was able to find this one. It was reissued in an abridged edition in 1969. And it has works by Arturo Schomburg, if you're familiar with the Schomburg Center, right? Samuel Beckett, of all people. Langston Hughes, William Carlos Williams, W.E.B. Du Bois. And one of the pieces Zora Neale Hurston writes is called Characteristics of Negro Expression, where she writes about The Negro's universal mimicry is not so much a thing in itself as evidence of something that permeates his entire self, and that thing is drama. His very words are action words. His interpretation of the English language is in terms of pictures, one act described in terms of another, hence the rich metaphor and simile. So no little moment passes unadorned. And of course, she's talking about this idea of like the black dandy, okay? Because one thing that I know as a black person is black people like to promenade, right? So I'm going to read these last two pieces. A bit of Negro drama familiar to all is the frequent meeting, and here you see her anthropological training, right? It reads almost scientifically, right? Like she's, meeting of two opponents who threaten to do atrocious murder upon one the other. Who has not observed a robust young Negro chap posing on a street corner, possessed of nothing but his clothing, his strength, and his youth? Does he bear himself like a pauper? Now, in Richard Wright's world, yes, he would. But she says, no, Louis XIV could not be more insolent in his assurance. His eyes say plainly, female, halt. His posture exults. Ah, female, I am the eternal male, the giver of life. Behold in my hot flesh all the delights of this world. Salute me, I am strength. All this with a languid posture. There is no mistaking his meaning. And on the other side, a Negro girl strolls past the corner lounger, her whole body panging. You have to look up pang in her dictionary. That calls attention to her bust. That is all of a dare. A hippie undulation below the waist that is a sheaf of promises tied with conscious power. She is acting out, I'm a darn sweet woman, and you know it. These little plays by strolling players are acted out daily in a dozen streets in 1,000 cities, and no one ever mistakes the meaning. So as an anthropologist, she is looking at, some guy standing there, and a woman walks by, and this whole unspoken language, right? So in characteristics, she goes through that, and she also talks about black language, just to get back to this idea of language, the double descriptive that she says is a feature of black language. High tall. What does high tall mean? That means he's really tall, right? Little teen ninchy. Low down. Top superior. Lady people. Kill dead. A chop axe. Sitting chairs. What else are chairs used for, right? So it's like a verbal noun, right? It's what it is and it's what it does, right? So if you chance to look through Negro, you can also find the entire essay online. Very, very funny. Verbal nouns to funeralize someone. Okay? Sends me into it. Ugly in a way. Won't stand a broke. She won't take a listen. He won't stand straightening, right? So if you read the entire essay, you get to see a lot of what it is that, occupied the intellectual space of a Zora Neale Hurston and of other black writers of that era, right? And then finally, and this is what she says about writing, she says, I am not tragically colored. There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all. I do not belong to the sobbing school of Negrohood, meaning Richard Wright, who hold that nature has somehow given them a low-down dirty deal and whose feelings are all hurt about it. Even in the helter-skelter skirmish that is my life, I've seen that the world is to the strong, regardless of a little pigmentation more or less. No, I do not weep at the world. I am too busy sharpening my oyster knife. So she's going to get on with it. And she had a feud with Richard Wright as well, which if you are in your library and you read about Zora Neale Hurston, you can find out more about it. I think I have like 1 minute left. I just wanted to point out to you a couple of things that I think make good reading. One is this novel, The Life of Herod the Great. Hurston died in a welfare home, penniless, sick, was not celebrated, while she was working on this novel. It was finally published just this year, or end of 24 into 25. This other book, and I have a copy of this, is by an author named George M. Johnson, Plainfield author. He wrote the best-selling book, All Boys Aren't Blue. He's one of the most banned authors of 2021 because he writes about his life as a young black gay man. This is his new book, and it's Flamboyance, The Queer Harlem Renaissance, I Wish I'd Known. It's a great, wonderful book. I wanted to show you one other thing. Literary journals often didn't last very long. I was part of one when I was in college. We lasted one issue. But this is a really famous one. I wish I'd put it up here, called Fire. And this has the works of a number of names that you know. It was published in 1926. It's available as a facsimile. But this was, these were the new Negro artists of the Harlem Renaissance. It wasn't even called that, of course, right? That's retrospective. But it's edited by Wallace Thurman, and it has works by Hurston, Richard Bruce Nugent, County Cullen, and others who at the time were very, very young artists. They were not the folks that we know today. So that's worth a look. And then just to end, Toni Morrison, just bringing us back around to language. She says, we die. That may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives. So, start with Toni, end with Toni. It's her birthday. I know it's time for us to leave, but if anyone has any comments, please, I'd like to hear what you, oh, here we are. Here we are.
Thanks. I want to go back to the language of Zora Neale Hurston with all her little funny ditties or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And you said it's difficult to keep up with what's hip and what's current that our kids know. All of that is coming from the Black community.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
and then it finds its way even into newscasters. Like
Sure.
now they say, you know, that should have happened from jump. But
Right.
that started in the Black community.
Right.
All of these things, I mean, language
Mhm.
is really like where would we be if there were no Black people in America?
And that's the unspoken question here, is what would, American culture is Black culture. When what you said, right, from jump, right? I'm so old, I still say, oh, that was the bomb. They said they haven't said that since the 90s. I was like, that was my decade, Any other comments just before? I don't want to keep everyone too
I just
long.
want to say one, to add what Jackie was saying, because the evolution of the English language in this country is owed to Black people who are constantly reinventing it every 40 to 50 years. Here we are in what was, and I'll just use some of the kids nowadays, we don't understand what they're saying any more than my parents or understood.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? It's a revolving evolution of the language that we contribute to so heavily.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, about language, it is ever evolving, right? And, Black language back at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, there was this resistance on the part of Black writers using, what would be called dialect, right? Black dialect, regional writing, fine, right? I guess that's what we call it. But it was, to say we have moved beyond this. Oftentimes, like we read a story that had a lot of dialect in it in one of my classes today. And the student, you can't read it. You have to hear it in order to understand it, right? So, but what you see textually is that writing says, I am inferior, I don't know how to speak proper English, and so forth. And that's what it was often used for by white writers, to show someone was uneducated, which, of course, at the same time, also meant they lacked intellect and so forth. So a lot of writers moved away from that. A writer like Paul Laurence Dunbar, wrote a lot of dialect poetry, right? But he also wrote other kinds of poetry, but some of his white audiences said, oh, let us hear that dialect, like I guess it reminded them of their old Kentucky home or something, something like that, right? So this question of language, one of the things that these writers would say is, celebrate all language, right? The slang, dictionaries, I'm still getting used to some of the things my students say. As long as it's not an insult, we celebrate it, and writers write it, right? That's kind of all I had to say. So I know it's past time. If there's, I think there's one or two more comments.
Can you speak briefly about Zora Hurston? Didn't she write a book, her last book, about the African slave? What was it called? Palatine?
Yeah, Barracoon was,
Barracoon.
she wrote.
She did a video of it, right?
She
interviewed
So Zora Neale Hurston, she, as an anthropologist, she interviewed a man named Cudjoe, who was the last slave on the Clotilde, the ship that the last slave ship, right? Now we know the transatlantic slave trade ended in 1808.
Wasn't that illegal though? They brought them over there illegally, right?
Yes, that was my point, right? It ended in 1808, so it should be done. But of course, this ship comes into the harbor in 1865, and so he's still alive. This man named Cudjoe. So she interviews him and writes this book that came out about maybe 3-4 years ago called Barracoon. It was published, right? The Herod book was the one she was still working on when she passed away. And whatever you know about Herod the Great, you have to see, I haven't finished reading it, you have to read what Zora Neale Hurston thinks of Herod. Very interesting. But there are also a few documentaries. One came out about Hurston a few years ago called Jump at the Sun. And then there's another one, I didn't put it in here, but there are a number of documentaries. And if you go to my favorite place, YouTube, you can actually see she took footage. There's footage of her doing her anthropological work. Right. Well, there are some audio recordings, separate, but audio recordings of her, singing some of the folk songs and spirituals and so forth as she's collecting, because that was her training under Franz Boas, right? So, any other comments or questions? Well, yes, sir.
Follow up about her linguistics. They're just poetic genius. Mm-hmm. And we gotta look at the geographics. She grew up in Eatonville, Florida. I've been to her museum in Eatonville. There's nothing in Eatonville. So some of her language won't be the same language as a Langston Hughes or a slick talking Harlem-born James Baldwin. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But it's just so poetic, those descriptions you describe. Mm-hmm, but like I said, she probably been around some jukebox clubs and
the juke joint.
So, So the geographics definitely play a role in the linguistics.
Mm-hmm. And what was called regional writing when white writers did it was called just Negro dialect. But as you're pointing out, there's a big difference between how rural Floridians speak and how rural Georgians speak. Right? They're I shouldn't say completely, but they're quite different. Right? So. In closing, I just want to again thank the Westfield Library. I'm so glad to see so many people came out. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Read books. Books are free. Anybody can read books if you get them from your library. If you can't read, right? One of the greatest inventions, audiobooks for everyone. And every library has a literacy program, so if you can't read, there's somebody who will teach you to read so that you can enjoy the pleasure and joy that we all get out of books. So, thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much. All three of our presentations have been different but great. And that's what I think is a really wonderful situation. I also want to remind you the next presentation is Monday evening. Jason Williamson will be talking about the power of activism. Good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jerry. Appreciate it. Hey, Jerry. Oh, thank you.